everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We're going to go ahead and get started, and people will be joining us throughout. My name is Rachel Banks, and I'm a legislative assistant here at the Religious Action Center. And I'm happy to be hosting this with Shelly Christensen in Say Yes, Bringing Inclusion into Your Synagogue. So Shelly, if you want to go ahead and get us started, it's all you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. It's terrific, and I'm really happy to be here and to be able to welcome all of you to this work. This is really exciting, and of course you know it's Jewish Disability Awareness Month, and it has the unfortunate acronym of JDAM, but it's pretty institutionalized now, so we're very excited because this is only our 5th year of raising awareness to foster inclusion of people with disabilities in Jewish life. And of course that includes their families, and it includes all aspects of Jewish life. And what we try to do during Jewish Disability Awareness Month is to help people become more empathetic towards people with disabilities and their families, and to unite communities to raise awareness. This has really been the impetus, championing inclusion and provide opportunities and ways for that to happen. And we really want to thank all of you for not just being here, but for participating in your own communities in Jewish Disability Awareness Month. We have some wonderful programs going on this year. We started JDAM Reads, which is a great program where we choose a book, or two, as in the case this year. Elaine Hall, Now I See the Moon, and Brad Cohen, Front of the Class. Both of those books are featured, and they're great for discussions. They're great to use in religious school, in confirmation classes. There are films associated with both of those books. So it's a real opportunity to train. And here in Minneapolis, where I live, we are actually hosting a community-wide book discussion. We're not doing it in February, we're doing it in March, which really kind of takes us to the topic, to the next slide, actually. With the name of our, thank you, with the name Say Yes, Bringing Inclusion into Your Synagogue. I want to just tell you how we came up with this name of Saying Yes. It's Lisa Friedman, who you'll get to meet next week. We were talking one day about how many people with their disabilities always and so often hear the word no. And it could be no as in, we don't know what to do, we don't know how to help you, no, we don't have access. There's a lot of no's, and we just said, let's just start saying yes. The point of saying yes is opening the door so that people with disabilities can come in. We don't have to say to them, well, wait until we can prepare for you. Wait until we can add the right number of steps or do all the work that we need to do. It's really more effective when people with disabilities are just part and parcel of the congregation or whatever Jewish organization. So we decided to call our series Say Yes, and it's really an affirmation. As we go through the webinar, when you have questions, you can type them. You'll see a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can raise your hand icon, and it's great to have questions as we're going. I'd really encourage you to do that. Questions and certainly comments. Part of this is sharing. Well, I want to give you a little background about me and how I came into this work, because like many of you, there's a personal story. There's something in the background. So my husband Rick and I have 3 sons, Aaron, Jacob, and Zachary. Aaron's in the middle, Jacob's on the left side, and Zach is on the right side. So all 3 have attended their synagogue religious school through confirmation. They've celebrated becoming B'nai Mitzvah, of course, grew up in a Jewish home, and not only that, they've all been to Israel in different ways. They're very committed to Judaism. It's kind of funny because our last name being Christensen, people don't always know we're Jewish. And by the way, they don't always wear tuxedos. This was a special family event. Well, my story is actually bound up in Jacob's story. And this was Jake. He was about 18 months old when this picture was taken, just as you can tell. So adorable. He was very kind of quirky in the sense that he had a lot of rules about what he would wear, what he would eat. When I would leave him at preschool, it would take him a good hour to make the transition, and I don't have the pictures here now, but there are pictures of him just crying. When they take those pictures in preschool for the kids, he would just cry and cry and cry. And interestingly enough, he was our middle child, and we weren't looking for anything wrong with him. This was just who he was. He was really funny, and he was very articulate for a young child, and as you'll soon see. And this day, he's just Jacob. So he went to a Jewish preschool, and he was, as you know, in Jewish preschool, they have the Abba and the Ima of the week. So I went to school to see, for his Shabbat, and he was the Abba for Shabbat. And I saw this poster on the board of Jacob's favorite thing. So, I looked at it. It's like right from Jacob's mouth. His favorite color was green. Favorite TV show was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I know that dates me, but his favorite food was pizza. And his favorite book was Gone with the Wind. Now, I don't know about you, but that seemed a little surprising to me. I knew that he had neither read the book or seen the film. And it just struck me as so quirky and so funny. And when I asked him why he chose the book, he said, well, because it's your favorite book, Mom, and I love you. It was just, it was kind of one of those things later on when he was diagnosed eventually with Asperger's syndrome. It was just like, oh yeah, now that makes a lot of sense. So he went through elementary school. He did great. People got to know him and appreciate him. You can see lined up here the dinosaurs. Also did the same thing with cars. He loved being around adults, and he was diagnosed when he was 8 years old. Now, religious school had never been a problem for him, so that was probably the one place we never encountered any trouble with him. As he came up fast, kind of with this photo, this was his photo taken about the time of his bar mitzvah. And I was so worried, how is he going to study? Because he didn't do his homework, and he was kind of fidgety. And so I would sit in on his tutoring lessons until finally the tutor just said, Mom, you really don't need to be here. He's doing very, very well. What I learned, and I know you see this so often too, is that kids have their own way of learning, and they have significant strengths. Every child does that. And so he didn't learn the way his brother learned. He learned his own way. And it was a very auditory way of learning, memorizing, and then being able to learn it more by rote. It was a very meaningful bar mitzvah, just like they all should be. So it's just one way to access knowledge. Now, can you go back one, Rachel, just one? About the time this photo was taken, that's Jake with his hamster Tyke. He was starting to have a lot of trouble. Things were falling apart at school. He wasn't doing his homework. He appeared not to listen to his teachers. And this is when the series of what I call Mrs. Christensen calls started to happen. I was very, very frustrated by the lack of support at school. During the day at his religious school, which he went to twice a week at our synagogue, Bet Shalom, in Minneapolis, he did very well, and I realized this was because they just accepted him, and no big deal. But in school, they would just come down on him so badly, and so finally I decided I really needed to know a lot more than I did. And Lisa's going to get into more of this parenting thing next week, but I just want to, it's part of our story. I did take advocacy training, so I was very knowledgeable about the law, and that's when I got the Mrs. Christensen call. Now you can go to the next slide. You're probably wondering why there's a pencil in this photo. Simply stated, the principal called me at work one day, and he said, Mrs. Christensen, I'm going to give Jacob in-school suspension for poking a hole in a concrete wall with a pencil. I just went off the deep end. I thought that was really absurd. what eventually the upshot of that was they finally did evaluate him to see if he qualified under the Individuals with Disability Education Act, IDEA, which he did. And so the next time we met up with them later in the school year, we went to conferences and they said, Mrs. Christensen, we know you don't like in-school suspension for Jacob as a punishment, so this is what we're going to do instead next time he acts out. You can go to the next slide. We're going to put him in a cab with a toothbrush and send him to the school bus depot and have him clean buses with a toothbrush. So that's what really set me off, is the ignorance that we faced so often. We took him out of that school district. We open enrolled him in another district where he was eventually, we did an academic assessment, and he was, we learned that he had Asperger's syndrome. So next slide is the clinical description of Asperger's syndrome as it was in the DSM, the last iteration of the DSM. It's changed now, but I want to just call out to you the clinical descriptions that we see about people, whether they're children or adults. These are typical things you might see as an indication of a particular diagnosis. But when you really get to know the person, what you really learn is that they are just who they are. And we can't make suppositions, certainly, because of the diagnosis. The next slide, and this is really the last slide about Jacob and our family, but you can see his graduation picture on the left. The bottom picture is taken when he was in Birthright, and he went on a Birthright trip several years ago. It was an amazing trip. It really cemented his relationship with Israel, his love of Judaism, and of course his parents were just felling as can be. The bottom picture is Jacob speaking at a conference on disabilities, and he's speaking about having Asperger's syndrome. Yes, he knows he has it. He's very articulate about it. And so it's one of the things that, again, makes Jacob unique. Yes, he has some of those features that you saw on the previous slide, certainly, that qualified for his diagnosis. He's, as I said before, he's just Jacob. So when taking all of that kind of life with our son that I never signed up for, obviously, you know, not too many people sign up to raise a child with a disability. I can be perfectly honest with you and say I would never change a thing, except that I wish Jacob didn't have to go through some of the difficulties that he has in life. The next slide, just to kind of tell you how all this morphed. I became the program manager for a brand new program in Minneapolis. It's the Minneapolis Jewish Community Inclusion Program for people with disabilities. It's housed at Jewish Family and Children's Service of Minneapolis, and this was really groundbreaking work at the time, and still is, where we worked with congregations in the community as well as the social service agencies, Federation, the JCC, and all these organizations to help them make that big transition, if you will, from good intentions to tachlis, to doing what's good and right that we should do. And so that's been my experience for the last 12 years. And I am very proud of the work that we've done. It's been very collaborative. And I really want to say, first of all, that no one does this alone, that you always need partners. There's a lot of awareness raising that has to be done. And I wish you could spend a day with me on the job and just meet the fabulous people I've met and hear their stories and work with them to achieve the lives that they really want from their community. So speaking of collaborations, a group of lay leaders, including people with disabilities, wanted some direction in their organizations and how to make things really click. And so we worked together for about 6 months to figure out what that would be, and that's how the Jewish Community Guide to Inclusion of People with Disabilities came into being. And it is the down and dirty on how to be inclusive. What we're going to focus on here isn't so much about the long term, although I will mention that, but I think that, you know, to some of you have already gotten started, some of you are in the process of starting out. on this inclusion journey, I really want to give you some of the basic things that you can be doing, as well as some of the longer term things that will come up. So I've sort of divided this into categories. Next slide talks about good intentions, and we all have them. And Judaism demands not just good intentions, but action. I love this quote from the great Hasidic master, Yehudi HaKadosh. Good intentions not followed by action are without value, for it is the actions which make the intentions so profound. And this is really what we carry with us as sort of a value statement for the work of inclusion, because everybody knows it's the right thing to do, but we often get stymied by what action we should be pursuing. And so a lot of the work of inclusion that you do in congregations has to do with what your good intentions are, but really what actions you can take to make those intentions come to life. So just to give you a little bit of a Jewish bent on things, we know, of course, we're all created b'tselem Elohim in the divine image. I'd like to sometimes ask the question, if we're created b'tselem Elohim, if people with disabilities, if all of us are created b'tselem Elohim, what does that say about God? It's certainly food for thought. Moses, of course, had a speech disability, begged God, please, I can't do this. I don't want to be the leader of the Jewish people. And what did God say? You're the man, essentially. Moses had those qualities that God was looking for in a leader. Moses didn't see it himself, but he grew into that role. And he didn't do it alone. He had a lot of support as well. A lot of good support, divine support. And even in as we go into the book of Numbers in Beha'alotecha, when Miriam was stricken with leprosy as a consequence of her behavior, the community would not move on until she came back into the community. And I like to think of that as a saying, we can't move on until we're whole unless all of us are here. We're not full. We're not who we can be. So in 2000, even though the survey is 13 years old, it has a great deal of validity. It was done by Harris Interactive, that people with disabilities are more isolated from their communities, and we know that. It can be very isolating. And community consists of many different things, but as we know, religious community is very, very important. Being involved also creates connectedness, and it creates a sense of value, that an individual is valued. The other part of this equation is that in the United States Census, we know that nearly 20% of people in the United States have some sort of disabling condition. Now, when we add mood disorders and mental illness to that, the number, of course, increases. And so when we look at our congregations, of course, that's 20% of the people in our congregations. And yet, could we say, yes, we're serving those 20%. They are welcome. We are meeting their needs. We are talking to them. We are learning about what their needs are. And chances are, we're not completely. And so we have some work to do. The next slide, my grandfather, Oliver Shalom, Zadie Max, to be known, you have to be shown. So part of the reason there used to be, we kind of joke about this now, that in the old days you'd call a synagogue and say, what do you have for people with disabilities? And they would say, we don't have people with disabilities in our congregation. Probably because people didn't feel welcome, because they just weren't there. And so this is another basic understanding that we can all share, is that to know that people are there, they have to be in our sanctuary, in our classrooms, in our boardrooms. So this is a really, really important feature. It used to be that we would wait for people to come. We would get a call maybe that there's going to be a bar mitzvah and the grandmother can't ascend the stairs to the bima to pass the Torah down. And we would hopefully make an accommodation. We either bring the Torah down to the grandma or move the reading desk to the floor so grandma could come up for an aliyah. It's those kinds of things where we used to react, and that's good because we have history of doing those kinds of things. We just need to do them and help other people to be able to access Judaism in the way they wish to. The barriers to inclusion. This is really important that we talk about this. There are 3 different kinds of barriers, and you'll see the first 2 here. The first 2 have everything to do with access. So, for example, in old-time synagogue, and a lot of us still have buildings that, that either haven't been retrofitted or we haven't built new buildings. That's reality. It's walking up the stairs, for example. I know people, and I'm sure you do too, that in order to get into the building had to be carried if they were in a wheelchair, if they used a wheelchair. So, sometimes getting up the steps is not very practical, and it's very undignified to schlep somebody up the stairs. I just want to say that. So how do you get around that? You ask the person who has the disability. The other kinds of barriers are communication barriers. And if we just go back really quickly to the slide previous, things like prayer books that aren't accessible in other formats. So large print, for example, and that's always a good accommodation. Poor lighting is really important. If we use sign language interpretation, making sure that the interpreter and the people who are communicating, that they're communicating to, have access, that they're easily seen. Certainly assisted living devices. I love stories when congregations say, yes, we have assisted living devices, listening devices. First of all, the ushers don't know where they are, and second of all, they may not work. So part of knowing where those devices are is making sure that they're in working order as well. So the barrier that's the most difficult, I think, for all of us to navigate is simply this slide that you're seeing right now. It's the barrier of attitude. It's insidious. And if you think about it, what is the impact of these kinds of attitudes on being able to provide meaningful participation for people with disabilities? Some of us who have children with disabilities have heard these favorite lines: you must have done something to deserve this, or God doesn't give us more than we can handle. Oh, thank God my children don't have these problems. People are not cruel. I believe that. They just don't know what to do. And so part of what we take on as advocates for inclusive congregations is that we have to be very cognizant that people will have these kinds of attitudes or understanding because they just don't know. They're not being cruel. And I want to just remember that the world is full of good intentions. And it's really important as we're working with people to help change the congregational kind of the congregational attitudes, that we become educators as well. So those are really important things to remember. One of the keys to inclusion is to have a vision. So when you look at your congregation, you can use the next slide. When you look at your congregation, you look at the barriers, and I'm hoping that you've been thinking of some of those barriers as we've been going through these slides. What would your congregation look like if there were no barriers to participation, or if the barriers could be navigated, or if there could be accommodations, if we could work together with people who have disabilities, if we could imagine that there are other ways to do things besides the status quo, if we could stop and listen, if we could make communication and building relationships part of our vision, we're going to go a lot further than we ever dreamed possible. So, I'm going to talk about tachlis. The next couple slides are all about tachlis. Tachlis meaning the action. Kind of talked about intention. Now we're talking to action. And the start of this, when I was creating this presentation, I thought, what do you really need to know? You know, do you get started with an inclusion committee right away? Do you what do you do? An inclusion committee is a really important part of this work, and we'll go into a little bit more detail later. Just like your synagogue has a dues committee, a membership committee, a ritual committee, an education committee that are charged with specifics in those areas. So should you have an inclusion committee? A lot of synagogues make inclusion committees a part of their social action committees, or different iterations. And I think that I want to stress with you one thing to maybe help guide your thinking. Inclusion may seem like it belongs under a particular organization within your congregation, but remember this, that inclusion of people with disabilities is woven into the entire fabric of the congregation, and the reason for that is because people with disabilities should have choice and should have access to all of those different areas. So I think I have convened an inclusion committee on here twice. So make sure that you are engaging people in conversation about an inclusion committee. Make sure it includes people with disabilities. One of the easiest things you can do right away is post a statement about your congregation. In fact, and I should have put this up here, Old York Road, Temple Beth Am near Philadelphia has this wonderful statement in the beginning when you walk in, and if I think about that, I can put that up on the JDAM website, or Rachel, I can send it to you. We can put that up because it really is a welcoming statement for all people. Make sure that you have accommodation statements in all your printed materials, your website. We welcome requests for accommodations if you have a disability, something along those lines, just to make sure people understand that you are welcoming. You could have a go-to person who takes requests for those accommodations, or better yet, train everyone on your staff to be able to do that. One of the most amazing things, I think, and simple, is to take a mezuzah and put it at wheelchair height, and also at the height so children can reach it, and hold a ceremony. I was at one recently. It was the religious school, so all the kids stood around while the rabbi placed the mezuzah at wheelchair height, or I think they lowered it about 7 or 8 inches. It wasn't much, and it's a very meaningful thing to do. That is a sign of welcome. So you can certainly celebrate Jewish Disability Awareness Month and all of these things too. But let's go to the really easy stuff to do. Next slide. It's just creating an atmosphere of welcome. And I mentioned usher training earlier so that we know where things are. Mentioned ASL training. Having greeters at the door. If somebody's never been in your congregation, where do they go? And and also having maybe volunteer valets to help with parking is certainly something. I put here Wheelchair Plus. What Wheelchair Plus means is that if somebody is coming into your congregation and there are spaces reserved for people who use wheelchairs, so their chairs can fit right in, make sure that there are seats for their family members or whoever they're coming with, or their friends, so that they can sit together. I think it's really difficult to be sitting out there, not with the people that you want to sit with during services. So just remember that. And then, of course, the oneg. really important to make sure that people who have, who have disabilities or who are uncomfortable are welcome during the owning. That's a really great time to just talk to people and get to know them. And again, use people's names, because that is so important. Be sure, by the way, if you have any questions or you want to raise your hand, be sure to do so. Okay, just want to reiterate that. We can go to the next slide. Here's some other things. Like these are, yes, they're common sense, but sometimes we need to call them out because it just makes things, it just is like these are best practices, if you will. Make sure every child has a bat mitzvah date. I recall hearing from a mom whose child she didn't think was going to be able to have a bar mitzvah because of his disability. And so she was shocked in the 5th grade when her rabbi called and said, I didn't see your son's name on the list for bar bat mitzvah. We have to get his date on here. And she said that that was the most wonderful feeling in the world to know that her son was going to have a bar mitzvah. And he did. And it was a wonderful experience. It was a unique bar mitzvah. And it was a beautiful bar mitzvah. But just the fact that the rabbi called and said, hey, you're part of us. You and your family are part of us, and acknowledged that her own hopes and dreams was really powerful. You can label foods that you serve. A lot of congregations now are labeling foods. They're providing gluten-free foods, marking down if things have nuts or dairy, things like that, because a lot of people have food allergies. Some congregations at their staff meetings may choose a month, or they may do this semi-regularly, and they do text study on inclusion, depending on what the parsha is for that particular week. And it can be a short little discussion, a short little conversation, but it's there. Always include the person who has the disability and their family. It's very disconcerting if you're speaking to somebody, if somebody is present with you and you're speaking to either an interpreter or their family member and not including them in the conversation. So always speak to the person who has the disability. Always include them also as you're trying to find solutions or identify challenges to participation. Practice collaboration with the individual. That's a very, very important thing. And that means listen carefully. When we talk about listening carefully, some people have disabilities where their speech is harder to understand. And I have a friend who I used to say, she would say something and I would nod my head and say, yep. And she would always know that I didn't understand the things she said. She said to me one time, I know I'm hard to understand. I don't expect you to always get it the first time. So just listen carefully, and if you don't understand, please ask me, because what I have to say is very important. Talk about flexibility. There's more than one way to find an accommodation. There's lots of different ways that we can be flexible. We're seeing a lot of that in bar and bat mitzvah training, as well as in how bar and bat mitzvahs are presented. And it's very exciting, I think, because we're really allowing young adults, these new Jewish adults, to show their strengths, to demonstrate their strengths as Jews. And that's very exciting. You can use person-first language. Person-first language is, instead of saying that so-and-so is autistic, you might say Jacob has autism. Put the person first, because when you do that, then the whole of the person becomes really important. And in language is such a strong indicator of how we see the world. It's a good practice. You're going to hear people who will say, "Oh, it doesn't matter to me," and you can call me disabled or things like that. So if you're not sure, ask the person how they would like to be referred to. I'm guessing they'd like to be referred to by their name. Make sure that you have that accommodation statement everywhere you go to. So on all of your communications on your website and so forth. Next slide. Modeling inclusion. It's as leaders in congregations, we are bound to do that. And we are bound to, when we say model inclusion, we're bound to ask, we're bound to listen, we're bound to collaborate, we're bound to do all of these things that we talk about. When we study Jewish values in religious school, add inclusion to that. Add inclusion of people with disabilities to the study of Jewish values. There's a lot of great information out there through the Jewish Special Education Consortium at www.jsped.org on how to teach Jewish values that use inclusion as a strategy. You can connect parents, certainly if you know people who, if you know parents who maybe would benefit from speaking to each other. There's nothing more affirming to a parent than meeting another parent who's either been on that journey or who is walking the same walk as you are. Looking at education across the lifespan, and this is so important as we talk about inclusion of people with disabilities. We're talking about from birth till the end of life and including people, and that's really important. So all of the educational programs, social programs, everything that you do, remember this is a lifespan and lifelong. Remember too, for accessibility, if you have a building, if you're doing an event in a building that isn't accessible, say that you usually have your adult education on a second floor room, but there's no way to get to that second floor unless you can take the stairs, change the room location. Also be aware of seating, and it's nice when people can connect with each other, sit by other people, and so forth. At least once a year, provide a brief session on inclusion for all arms of your organization, and that means, and you can do this during Jewish Disability Awareness Month certainly, or anytime, doing something for your board and for, you know, in the sisterhood, the brotherhood, in committee meetings, in services, in religious school. So there's always an opportunity. Next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about inclusion committees and the initial work of your inclusion committee. Make sure that, you know, when you create this committee, that there are people with disabilities on that committee. When I first started in my work in Minneapolis, we had a community inclusion committee, and when I first started this program, I looked around and I was thinking to myself, well, there's a lot of parents on this, and there's a lot of educators, and there's people representing the social service agencies, but I don't see anybody here who has a disability. The disability movement, the self-advocacy movement has a great saying, nothing about me without me. And that's one of those, again, one of those kind of billboards, those highlights, those phrases that really is helpful. The Inclusion Committee looks at, first of all, creating a mission statement. And the mission statement is really about the expectations of the congregation. This is where we want to be. We want to welcome all people. It can be that simple. And certainly publicize that. Also, be sure to include the board in anything that you do. Make sure your Inclusion Committee has been sanctioned by the board. And include the board, welcome the board, asking, you know, presenting your inclusion statement, keeping them updates. In fact, one of your committee chairs may even be a board member, and that's a nice way to bring people in. The Inclusion Committee develops the accessibility statement, publishes the mission statement. If you look below, you can see a couple of different mission statements and then an accommodation statement as well. So these are really basic things, really easy things to do. And of course, Jewish Disability Awareness Month is the next slide, just the picture. We're in the middle of it right now. And this, again, is a great opportunity 1 month out of the year to start introducing inclusion, or also building on where you are currently. The next thing is the long term and for your inclusion committee. And these just are really critical things. I want to just briefly say something about some of these. Doing an assessment, learning where you are right now. So at this exact moment in time, what you've done, and everybody has done something to become more inclusive. Look at your foundation for right now. Create a vision for inclusion. Spend time saying, you know, in an ideal world, this is what our congregation would look like. And setting priorities and goals to help you get there. And also engaging who you're going to engage from your congregation. Do you have people from outside your congregation who can be helpful in training, that kind of thing? Looking at a timeline for when you expect things to be done. So, for example, if one of your goals is to do disability awareness training for the staff, then what you want to do is figure out who needs to be part of that process in terms of both training and participation in the training, when you'll be able to do that, and what you're going to be able to do, and how you're going to evaluate it. So that's an example of how this can work. And it's a very helpful and very useful process to be able to do. From there, you can continue to build new goals and new priorities as time goes on. The next slide talks a little bit about what success looks like. Obviously, this maybe isn't success right here, or maybe it is, and all the chairs are going to be filled by all kinds of people who participate in Jewish life. This question really is for each one of you, to look at what does success look like and what you will do in your own congregation, your own organization, to make sure that your inclusion efforts are successful. No one does this alone. I want to cite that again, next slide, that the inclusion committees can start, but as an inclusion committee, you always need someone else. As people who come together based on our values and based on who we want to be as a Jewish community, it takes everyone to make this happen. So think about who you want to get on board and who you need to get on board. Next step is, what are we going to do to take that first step? And that's something for you to think about. What will your next step be? Next slide is just to go beyond the words of inclusion to ultimately support all people as participants. I want to show you, here we go. Sorry, I just lost the webinar for a second. We have a very quick video that was made for Jewish Disability Awareness Month by Bet Shalom Congregation, and this video was done with people in the congregation who talk about inclusion and why it's important to them, and I think it'll really resonate with you. And then after that, we can take questions, and Rachel has some good information to share with you too about social action and inclusion and the Religious Action Center. So. Inclusion is one of the foundations of Judaism. In the Torah, in Genesis, it says we are created b'tselem Elohim, in the divine image. And that doesn't say only some people are created b'tselem Elohim. It says everyone is created b'tselem Elohim. We look to the text and we see that Moses was a person who had what we would consider to be a disability and in his speech pattern. And God identified Moses as the person who had the skills and the ability to lead the people out of Egypt.
whole, having the whole synagogue was really quite helpful. Just being able to come in and be here at times, and is helpful to just have some place I knew I could go.
When David started going to religious school, it was amazing how many people would come and help and offer us encouragement and adaptations just to make it a positive experience.
When it was time for my bar mitzvah, then they made adjustments for stuff that I just couldn't do, like I chanted the Hebrew at the bar mitzvah instead of singing it, and that really helped. They really understood me, what I could and couldn't do, and they believed in me when not even I did.
Working on helping disabled advocates to be more involved with the Synagogue.
When Jonathan turned 13, he had a bar mitzvah. One of my fondest memories, when Jonathan was in 5th grade, when he was 11, I got a call from Rabbi Cohen one day, and he said, I'm looking through my dates of Jonathan's class, and I realized we have not set a bar mitzvah date for him. At the time, I had for a few months sort of been turning over in my mind whether I should approach him, whether what we do for a bar mitzvah, whether we could have a bar mitzvah. And the fact that I got that call made a tremendous amount of difference. That it wasn't a question, but the rabbi said, we haven't set a date, what shall we do? It was a very meaningful day. There were lots of family and friends from the congregation here, and Jonathan was part of the community that day in the same way that all the other 13-year-olds were, and I think it was just very powerful for all of us who were here. He was very calm. He did his parts, and it was clear from the way he held himself that it meant something important to him as well. I guess one of the reasons that this has always been really a special place for us, because Jonathan has always had behavior issues. He's non-communication. We've always felt like we had to push to get him to be part of things. And here, it doesn't feel like I had to push. The way the congregation responded when he was young, we always came to children's services, and on several occasions when Jonathan had had a difficult evening, the rabbi always made a point to come to us afterward and say, "Hello, Jonathan, we're glad you're here." So it was one of the few places where our whole family felt that we belonged here together, and I think that was a tremendously important thing for us.
So what I've learned from all of this, I found what makes sense to me is real simple. Like, God is just good, or good energy. The more good I do and help others, the more things seem to work out. It turns out good.
If they want to participate, we will find a way for them to participate in Jewish life here. And I think that really provides exposure for the congregation at large to be able to see that this is truly a house for all people. And that's what we're striving for.
So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I'm Rachel. Again, I work at the RAC, and for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to work with the RAC, the Religious Action Center, what we do is we work in Washington on public policy. So while Shelly has given you all of these great tools to use to start change in your congregation and move to make our society more inclusive from the inside out, we work to do the same thing at the same time, kind of from the top down. And so what I want to talk to you right now is this one bill that's in Congress right now called the ABLE Act. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background, tell you what it can do, why it's necessary, and then a really quick action. I think Shelly and I's theme today, if not inclusion, is things that you can do easily and quickly. So hopefully you'll take at least one thing and do it. So under current law, people with disabilities who have more than $2,000 in assets are ineligible for a lot of essential government benefits like Medicaid. So families whose child won't go to college can't save money tax-free for future expenses like a savings fund for the college-bound would do. And these expenses could include costly caregivers and medical visits, housing, things like that. And in addition, adults with disabilities sometimes find it more expensive to work than to be unemployed since they can't save their earnings without forfeiting their government health insurance and other benefits. So we learn all of these Jewish values that were made in God's image, and we learn in Leviticus, you shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. And one of these stumbling blocks comes in the form of barriers in the path to economic self-sufficiency. So one of these ways we'd like to reduce this barrier is with the ABLE Act, and what it would do is it would provide secure funding for disability-related expenses on behalf of designated beneficiaries with disability. It would do that by creating a new subsection within the IRS tax code, which gets a little into the nitty-gritty. But expenses that would qualify in this would include things like education, housing, transportation, employment support, health prevention, wellness, assistive technology, personal support, and it goes on. So it's really this great idea, this great savings account that is something that's lacking for people with disabilities, both kids and adults, to be able to save for the future. So what you can do is you can take action now, and you can contact your member of Congress and urge them to co-sponsor the ABLE Act, which stands for Achieving a Better Life Experience. And you can do this by going to the RAC website, our High Impact Action Center, at rac.org/alerts, and it's the first alert on the page, and it's called Ensure Financial Security for People with Disabilities. So right now we can take questions, and I think it might cut us off at 4, so if it does, you can contact either me at rbanks@rac.org or Shelly at inclusioninnovations.com, and you can also visit the RAC website. Our disability issues page is listed, and also the Union for Reform Judaism's disability resource page has tons of ideas, and always Shelly's guidebook is the Bible of the second Bible of the Jewish inclusion movement.
It's never been called that before, but I'm kind of digging it.
So if we have any questions or else, I will leave you all. Thank you so much for learning with us today. We're really glad you guys could make it or available throughout the rest of Jewish Disability Awareness Month and the rest of the year to answer any questions and help you move forward